Hello everyone, it's Kim from Art Anthology. Thank you for joining me today. We are going to be painting a stamped image with Art Anthology's dimensional paint, and we're going to be taking advantage of one of the characteristics of the paint, and that is its translucency. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is find a stamp that we want to paint, and I am using a stamp from Stamplistic, and this is the cycle stamp that does have a lot of detail, but you can pick a stamp that is more open if you wish to have less detail. I'm going to be working on 110-pound cardstock because at the end of this I can either choose to keep it on the cardstock as a background or use this as a completed piece, or I can cut my image out and apply it to another substrate if I want. The second question after I pick out my stamp is, what color should I use? And a lot of times there are questions as far as what colors go together. So I pulled out my color wheel, and this will help guide me in a very simple way of what colors work together. So after I picked out the colors that I decided I wanted to use together, and I know whatever 4 colors appear in the windows will coordinate together and will work together, I needed to see what colors I had in my stash. So fortunately, I was able to find colors that coordinated or matched with these 3 colors. And those colors that I'm going to use are Tango, Crayon Apple, and 18 karat gold. And I'm using a gold rather than a yellow. And as we go along here, I will show you why I picked the gold. Originally, I used the yellow, and then I decided to use the gold. So those will be my 3 paint colors. And then for the 4th color, I'm going to use as my background, and I'm going to use the coloration sprays for that. And I wanted to use a couple sprays and not just one color. So I'm going to be using Peacock Feathers and Sky. So one's definitely darker and one's definitely lighter. So those are the colors that I have chosen to work with. And I know that they'll work because they're all on that color wheel popping through those windows at the same time. So my first thing that I need to do is to spray my background, and there's no right or wrong way to do this. You can do it in whatever manner you wish. I'm going to start with my lighter color, and then I'm going to add my peacock color. I can spray directly on my paper, I can spray on my mat and pick it up, or I could do a combination of both, and that's what I'm going to do, is a combination of both. And I'm going to start with my lighter color. I could start with a darker color, it really doesn't matter, but I'm going to start with a lighter color and spray it directly onto my paper. And I do want to get my stamped image colored as well, but I don't want to get it soaking wet. And there's a reason for that, which will be very clear here in just a second. And I'm going to get a baby wipe ready, just in case I need to dab some of this off if it's a little thicker in some areas than I want. So I'm just going to lightly spray that. I'm going to spray the center, and then I'm going to add my second color on the mat because this is a pretty intense color, and I'm even going to spray it with a little water just to move it around and just to dilute it a little bit because it is a pretty potent color. And then I'm just going to dab my stamped image in that. And I want some in the center, but again, I don't want it soaking wet. And I'm going to actually take, because I've done something to the center, and normally I would lay this down, but I don't want to put it on the back side and have it soak up underneath. But I have colored, or painted, I should say, some of these areas with the glass paint, and that will not absorb or it will resist the paint. So let me dab that a little more. And I don't want to get it too wet because in the back is where it will soak through and then come up underneath the glass paint, and that's not the effect that I'm going for. So let me just dab that off, and I've got some color on top of my stamped image. Let me just try for a little more there, and I'm not going to even worry about these outer edges right now. Now, if you don't use the glass paint on this, you will not have to worry about this at all, how wet that image is. So I've got color on my stamped image, and instead of having just all that dark, I'm going to go back through with my light again, and I'm just going to spray it just a little bit. but I'm not going to spray that stamped image. And I'm just going to set this aside. Now I've got a little more color, 2 different colors on that background. You can see how wet this is. I'm going to just set that aside. And now when I have a lot of color on my mat left, I don't want that to go to waste. So I always have some extra cardstock ready. So I can always make some backgrounds, and I could probably make 2 or 3 out of what's left here. And I can also spray this. So I'm not going to really spend any time working on this. I'm just going to pick up some color. And then I'm just going to set this aside, and I can use that at another time. So for now, I'm just going to wipe this up so we can move on to the next step. Now this needs to dry before I paint it, so I can either elect to use a heat gun to dry it out, but I prefer just to let it sit and dry on its own. So for now, I'm going to set this aside to dry, but you can see my white areas that appear, and that's the paper underneath the clear glass paint that I painted on after I stamped, let it dry, and then sprayed it so I can get those white areas to pop. So let's set this one aside. And I have another one that's already sprayed and dried and ready to paint. So we'll start with this one, and again you can see now that it's dried how nice and white those areas are that I used the glass paint on. So I'm going to pull out my 3 paints, and there's no specific order in which I do this. I don't pre-plan ahead of time what I'm going to do. I just get my small brush out and I just pick what areas I want to paint what color. So let's start with the crayon apple, and I can either pull some of this paint out and put it on my craft mat and pick it up, or I have a lot in the lid. I'm just going to use that from the lid, and a small paintbrush that's damp in water. So I just have a glass of water here to clean my brush, and I just am going to take a little bit because these are pretty small images, and then I'm just going to think, where do I want to start painting? So let's just do these leaves. We'll just start with those, and I take my time. And if I go a little outside the line, that's okay. I'm just picking up a little bit of paint because these are very small areas that I'm painting. If I was painting a larger area, then I could pick up more paint. So I'm just going to go around. I won't paint this whole thing today. And this is one of those perfect projects to sit in front of the TV or have a movie or music on and just relax and paint the different areas of our stamped image. And some of the paints go on darker than others. So this one is a pretty dark cranberry color, crayon apple color. So I will probably only do 1 coat. Some of the colors seem to go on lighter and are even more translucent. So then I may elect to go around after I color everything in with that color, go around and give it a 2nd coat, but not always. It just depends. But I think you can see, even though that's a bright, rich color, I still have all the detail that comes through. If I were using a regular acrylic paint, I would be covering up all those stamped lines, all that detail, and then I would have to stamp over it again in order to see all the detail of my stamp. So that is a great characteristic of this paint. Not only is it dimensional, but it's very translucent and yet still very rich in color. So I'll stop there with the crayon apple, and a lot of times I don't paint everything that I'm going to paint crayon apple. I just bounce around between my colors because I'm not sure what all I'm going to paint. And I'm not, again, going to paint absolutely every little detail. So let's use some of the Tango Orange. And let's see, this time we'll paint these little swirlies up here. And I'm trying to go fairly fast just so I can get a little bit of this covered so you can see what it looks like. But normally I take my time. so I can stay somewhat inside the lines. And once you get going, it actually goes fairly quickly. I guess I could paint that little bitty leaf thing there as well. We'll go back and pick these up. And I'll just paint one more and then we'll move on to the gold. And this might be a color that I would go over and paint again. Once I finished it, then I could see if I wanted it to be a little darker. All right, we'll call that good for the tango. And then let's just do a little bit with the 18 karat gold. And I'm using this for my yellow color on the color wheel. And the reason I'm doing that, I painted one earlier and I will show that one to you. And because the yellows are a fairly lighter color, because they are translucent, the background color came up through it. Not as far as mixing with it, but you could see that color come up through it. And it looked more of a lime green. So I thought I'm going to try the gold. And it does also have that like metallic finish to it, which is kind of neat as well. And it's still translucent, but it's not quite like the yellow. So the green, the bluish green from the background isn't as apparent through this paint. So let me just do a couple of these real quickly. And then we'll move on. This will give you some idea of what it looks like or what it's going to look like at the end. And I would paint some other details too, and I would obviously finish painting all the colors all the way around this image. But that gives you an idea of what it's going to look like when it is finished. Now the other thing I want to do is I want to add some interest to the background. I don't want to just leave it sprayed. And to do that, I'm going to use some stencils and some stamps. And again, you can use archival ink, but if I know that I'm not going to be spraying or wetting the background again, I can go ahead and use some distress ink. And I'm going to do that just to show you how you can use different inks. And because the inks are going to be on top of the sprayed area and not the paint area, I know that the inks will dry. If I was going to be inking on top of the painted area, then I would have to use archival ink so that the paint would totally, or the ink would totally dry. So I'm going to just take this one stencil and let me get a blending brush. And I'm not going to think about this. I'm just going to rub some color on here. I just want to add some color and interest to my background. When I overthink it is when I am not as happy with it at the end. So I do much better just to randomly go around and just try to have some fun. So there are my stenciled areas. And now I'm going to take another stamp. And I'm just going to, I'm not even going to put it on a block. I'm just going to ink it up. And again, I'm going to randomly stamp. I'm not going to think. I'm just going to go around. And again, this will add some interest to it. I don't care if it's a perfectly stamped image or not. I'm just going to press it around. And if I get a little bit on my main stamped image, that's fine. Because if it is on the painted portion, all I have to do is take my baby wipe, and I know the paint is going to resist that, and it easily comes up. And on these other areas, I'm going to paint over that, so I'm not too worried about that either. So there I go, and just that little bit really adds a lot of interest and more color into my background. And there's one other thing that I want to do, and that is to try to make this image pop up off of my background a little bit. And to do that, I'm going to use a Posca pen, which is actually a paint pen. So I'm going to shake it up. You might be able to hear that ball mixing up the paint inside. And the thing about the Posca pens is I can mark over anything. I can write or draw over any surface, even a non-porous surface. So when the paint dries, it becomes a non-porous surface, and it's hard to make anything stick on top of that. So that is one of the advantages of a Posca pen. And there's something else that it does, and these come in different nibs, and I'm going to use a 0.7 millimeter, which is a small nib. But let me show you how I'm going to use this to make this image pop. So I can just draw my line, and I'm going to let that sit, and you're going to see how quickly that dries. But the other thing that I'm going to do with it, I'm going to have my wet brush ready. It dries really fast, so I'm going to draw a line, short line, and then I'm going to take my wet brush, and you can see how I can move that paint off that wet area. And then there is another way to do this, but I'm going to do it a little differently this time. I'm going to use my water brush, and because this is my favorite water brush, I really don't want to get the paint into my tip. So I'm just going to take and draw my little line here of water, and then I'm going to take my Posca pen and I'm going to put it in that water, and you can see how it makes it bleed and feather out. So there's a couple different ways that I can use this, either just as a straight pen, put my line down and pull it out with a wet water brush, or use my water brush and then put the Posca pen on top. I'm going to go back to this first line. Once it dries, it does not move. And I picked some ink up from something else, but I'm going to do here. Let me clean my brush out here. And once it dries, you can see it doesn't move. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to do that to this stamped image, and I'm going to work in small areas at a time. I am not going to do the whole thing. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my water brush and I'm going to run it along the edge of this outside line, and I'm only going to do like half of one. I kind of see how far I can go before it starts drying, and then if it stays wet longer, I can go a little farther. But you can see how it lightly feathers and it makes that edge nice and dark. So let me finish that off. I'll just do the other half. And I know this seems like it takes forever, but once you get going, it actually goes by really fast. So I'm going to put that down, and now let me take this next little section, dampen that, and then I'm just running my pen on the edge of that line, and you can see how that feathers it out. So let's go down here and do it with the brush. Now, sometimes this seems like it really moves a lot, and other times I've had it where it doesn't seem to be moving as much. So I don't know if it just depends on how warm the day is here or what, but let's try it. So today I'm just going to go a little bit on the edge. I'm going to take my water brush and I'm going to go back through and pull that out. And so today it's not wanting to pull out. So if that happens, that's fine. I'm just going to get that wet with my brush. And now I'm going to go back. And because I have some moisture there, it will move a little more. So if yours is not moving as much as you want it to, don't give up. Now that I know that that's not wanting to move that much today, I'm going to put a little water down there, put my paint pen, and now I can go back through and I can move this. But you can see how that pulls it out a little more, and this is darker and it just bleeds more. It doesn't pull it out as much. But either one will make that edge darker. So again, try it on yours. I do think the substrate that you're working on affects how much that may bleed, but as long as that paint is wet, it will move a little bit with water. There's something else we can do with the Posca pens, and if I had my white pen, I would go back and I could doodle on the inside. There's so much detail on there, there's not much to doodle. But I'm going to use my black pen, and again, I would normally use my white, but this way you'll see it a little better. I'm going to go back with a different stencil, and this is a really fine, like bubble stencil. And this one is called Messy Bubbles. And I'm just going to go through and randomly use my Posca pen because, again, this is a fine tip. I can get in there in the stencil and just draw some of these bubbles. Randomly draw some of these bubbles around. And I like to do this with the white because then it adds some white back into my background. But this way you can see those really, really well if I use the black pen. With just another way to go back and add dimension. And again, if this had paint on it, this pen would be going over the paint. But since it's a sprayed background, it works just as well. So there's some different ways to add some dimension and some interest to your background and make that image pop. Again, I'll go back around and I'll finish this up, and I'll probably choose to do this way to outline it around the rest of my image. So let me show you some finished ones. And here is one that I've completed, and you can see this time how well that paint moved on the outside edge, quite a bit on this one. And you can see how I've decorated the background with stencils and with stamps, and I also added a die cut to it. And this die cut is from Stamplistic. This is the washed away die cut. And I had just die cut that out of a piece that I had used the dimensional paints on, and it was sort of a hot mess, but once I die cut it, it was gorgeous. One other little detail that we can add is this gold edge. You can see kind of the gold edge. So let me show you how to do that, and that just kind of frames off our piece. So what I'm going to use for that is the minks, and I'm using the gold dust minks, and the color is all at the bottom, so I need to shake this up a little bit. And I'm going to use a little palette just so I'm not chasing it across the craft mat. And I only need a few drops. And I'm going to add just a little bit of water because I don't need this real thick. I want it to be a thin, light edge. So I'm going to just take this with a little bigger brush, and I'm just going to run it along the edge of my cardstock, and you're going to see where it lifts the color up, and also put down the gold. And this will be more apparent after it dries than it is right now while it's wet. And you can make that edge as thin or thick that you want. But you can see when it hits that Posca pen, because that's dry, that is not moving at all. So let me just do the other edge. And you might be able to see a little bit of how that gold is. And again, once it dries, you'll be able to see the gold dust minks in there very, very well. So that is a great way to frame it. And so here is a finished one with that gold edge on it. And the whole image is painted, but yet you can see where I've left open areas so the background comes up. So let me show you another one with a different color. And some of you have already seen this. Let me wipe this up here. You have seen when I colored this, and you can see the white from the glass. So the white paper comes through. And then here it is after I've colored it. And again, I used the color wheel to determine what colors would coordinate together. And then I used a stencil and just used a blending brush to add, distressing through that stencil to add a lot of interest. And I kept that one fairly simple. And then added the gold edge on the sides here. And this stamp is again from Stamplistic, and this is Aesthetic. So it had some nice large open areas to paint, which I really, really loved how this one came out. And then here's the original one that I did with the colors that we just used. And this is using the Lively stamp. And I used the glass just on these little flowers here, so they were white. And I used the same colors, except instead of the gold, I used a yellow color. And you can see kind of how it turned somewhat of a green shade, and that's because the spray from the background comes through. It doesn't mix with the paint, but it comes through, the color comes through because the paint is so translucent. So that's where you'll just have to experiment and see what you like. I also just stamped the background and stenciled the background with Distress ink, and then I pulled out another die, and this time I used the Florentine die, but I cut it up into smaller pieces and just attached it to my background. And this one I'll probably still continue to work on, and I will probably still continue to work on this one as well and just add some more little elements to it. But that's the beauty of mixed media. You don't have to sit and complete it in one day. You can add to it as inspiration strikes. So I hope that gives you some inspiration today to try coloring some of your stamps and using the paints in a different way, whether you're using a detailed image or maybe a more open image. But all of the Anthology products can be purchased online at artanthology.net, and any of the stamps or die cuts that I showed you today are available at stamplistic.com. So thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you again in the future. The coloration spray, dimensional paint, Minx shimmering inks, and stencils used in today's project can be purchased online at artanthology.net, and the rubber stamps and dies used in today's project can be purchased at stamplistic.com.